Hello again, everybody, and welcome once again to another episode of Freeform Friday on a Friday, not pre recorded or recorded during a weekday in the middle of the week or on a Thursday. We are live here on Freeform Friday. As always, I'm your host, David Buchanan. Hope you're all doing great. Hope you're all doing well. Or should I say, Bonsoir Montréal! Ça va bien? I hope you're all doing real well. There's a method to the reason why I just said Bonsoir Montréal. Good evening, Montreal. How you all doing? And to everybody else watching us on Facebook, in Facebook land, and on the and in YouTube land as well. We stream live at Freeform Friday, and be sure, if you haven't already, to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and make sure that you click the bell notification so that you get notified every single time we go live. Hope everybody's having a great week so far, and hopefully everybody's having an awesome long weekend ahead, or is going to have a nice long weekend ahead. I'm going to be quite busy, to say the least. So, as I mentioned in my description, I had a couple of announcements that I wanted to make. Not quite sure if I'm going to get to them just yet. We got a lot of topics to cover, as per usual. We're going to try to get to each and every one of them. And Allan has just joined us, so we're going to add Allan to the broadcast. What's going on, sir? Thanks again for joining me. How are you doing this wonderful Friday, late Friday afternoon, early Friday evening?
Well, David, I'll tell you, Freeform Friday is actually on Friday this time. You got to give it to that. That's really exciting. Also exciting, this happens to be the... happens to be 37 years since the first SummerSlam emanated from Madison Square Garden. So I'm feeling a little hearkening of nostalgia, even though it's not a topic that we're going to directly address tonight. I have to say that considering how important SummerSlam has become, the fact that tonight, 37 years ago, was the beginning of the second attempt to get an annual pay-per-view running, and very exciting stuff. So it's nice to harken back to days of Mega Powers, Mega Bucks, yellow and teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini, whatever it was, which didn't materialize, and of course your friend Jesse the Body Ventura as the special guest referee enforcer tonight.
Oh, of course. We had Jesse the Body Ventura, who had just recently come back after shooting the highly successful Predator movie alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Indeed. Amazing stuff. But we're here now. It's 2025. It's August 29th. We got lots to talk about. So let's do it to it.
All right. And we got a couple of people in the room. Thank you, Steve Rockamaniac. Thank you for joining us as always. And of course, shout out to Steve, who has helped make it possible. He's assisted and he's done most of the work when it comes to the creation of the Freeform Friday YouTube channel. So this is going to be going live on YouTube as well as Facebook. And we should get right to it. I think the announcements are going to be left towards the very end. We got other stuff to talk about as well. So we got to build it up. It's one of those things where you got announcements coming, but you got to build up to it before you make the said announcement.
Well, it's like pyramids. We got to start from the bottom, build it up, and stand on the top and dance after, much like Dusty Rhodes would be genius. So.
Well, yeah, that they're both be genius and ABG with be genius and baby.
You got it.
So the first topic that you wanted to discuss, I can summarize the notes that you left me, but I can also read through your notes, or would you care to, or unless you need further clarification, I can go back to the notes and in case there's a blurb that you don't quite remember. But the first topic we were going to discuss was regarding the WCW US Championship Tournament that would go on to fill the vacated title 34 years ago this past Monday. And this would have went down at the Omni in Atlanta, Georgia on the 25th of August, 1991. Chat us up about that.
Yeah, so the summer of 91 was considered the worst summer in the history of WCW up until that point. And basically, you're dealing with all these title vacancies because Ric Flair has left the company. So the world title had to be settled last minute at the Great American Bash in July that summer. And Flair obviously was not involved in it. Fans were not happy. It was considered worst pay-per-view ever, most angry crowd. Just everything was kind of falling apart under the leadership of Jim Herd. And as I recall, it was because Luger, I think, was the U.S. champion maybe going in that he had to vacate that belt, was it? Or I can't even remember now who was the champion. I know Barry Windham had it that year, maybe at one point. No, he didn't have it. I think it was Luger. And Luger, because he won the world title and things, so again, they had another vacant title that they were going to use their biggest house show to fill the vacancy in a round robin type title tournament, and they were going to hold it. This wasn't a TV taping, certainly wasn't a pay-per-view, and back then the U.S. title, well, it did mean a lot then because it was sort of WCW's version of the Intercontinental title. It determined who the number one contender was for the world title, but this was one chaotic fire sale of a summer in WCW. It was a real disaster, basically. But there was also a lot of new talent coming in at this time, and one of those new talents was a guy named Steve Austin, who had joined WCW in the spring, and right off the bat, pretty much, he defeated beautiful Bobby Eaton for the TV title on, I believe it was June 3rd of that year in Birmingham, Alabama. So Steve Austin was coming into this tournament with a lot of momentum because he was the world television champion, and he wanted to see if a few months later he could just add the U.S. title to his resume. And again, there was no champion. So much like Royal Rumble 92 rather, whoever won this tournament would just become the U.S. champion and go on their merry way as a defending title holder from there. So the tournament, again, the Omni in Atlanta had been drawing less and less people. They used to probably draw like 12, 15,000 people easily. And again, for a non-televised event, this was not, it didn't even have to have TV cameras, and you just draw so many people. The business was house show based, and the Omni was the epicenter for, Georgia Championship Wrestling, the NWA, etc. And in this case, though, I mean, times were bad. But you had a lot of good talent. Like I said, you had new talent like Steve Austin coming in. You had Scott Hall, who had refashioned himself the Diamond Stud during this time, as Steve Austin was managed by his own wife, Lady Blossom, Jeannie Clark, at the beginning. I believe first he was with another girl. I can't remember her name now, Veronica or somebody, but he wound up with his wife, Jeannie Clark, managing him as Lady Blossom. And you had great talent at this time. Mark Merrow was really getting started as Johnny B. Bad. Brian Pillman had been wrestling under a mask as the Yellow Dog because he was serving out a loser leaves WCW suspension. And so the ingredients were there. The talent was there. Obviously, Ric Flair was not. Never mind the U.S. title tournament. He just wasn't there. So here they all squared off in a U.S. title tournament that night. But there were also some other non-related interesting matches on the card that evening. One of them involved the interesting tag team of Dick Murdoch and Dick Slater, who I've become very fascinated with in recent times because they were just, other than, the Terry Funks and Harley Races, were just two of the bare-knuckle toughest people around, and the fact that yes, they were a little past their prime, but that WCW would briefly put them together and consider them a serious contender for the Steiners World Tag Team title was really something at this point. They weren't successful at that, but not the guys you'd want to meet in a dark alley. Supposedly, that was the tagline on them. And on this night, they were going up against a very interesting team of Bill Kazmaier, the world's strongest man, who was legitimately, if you look it up and you watch the old footage, you can see him win the annual World's Strongest Man contest. This is the same contest that Ken Patera and Lou Ferrigno competed in, as well as others. And he gave it a shot as a wrestler, and he trained in Calgary with the Hearts, and he wrestled for Stampede Wrestling. He was never very good, but he was an imposing figure, even though he was a pretty laid-back, nice guy, but the kind of strength that emanated from this guy. So when Scott Steiner got injured and needed a replacement, Bill Kazmaier stepped in and was teaming with Rick Steiner, and in fact, they would lose the World Tag Team titles about 2 weeks after the show at the next Clash of Champions, when Arn Anderson and Larry Zbyszko, the Enforcers, would then be crowned champions. Scott Steiner was on injury leave at this point. Anyway, so one match of the Omni that night had Rick Steiner and Kazmaier go against the Hardliners, which it's probably better than it sounds on paper, because, I mean, Murdoch and Slater, you're familiar with the Dick Slater Sting locker room story from the UWF Mid-South?
I am not, but now that you brought it up, we gotta sidebar that. So chat us up.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dick Slater, as if he didn't have enough of a reputation as a tough dude, when he was working Bill Watts' territory in Louisiana, he was going out with a manager there, a lady by the name of Dark Journey, who would sometimes wrestle. I believe she got into a big feud with Missy Hyatt at one point. Hopefully Missy won't sue us over this, but it is true. They did have a feud. And Dark Journey was Dick Slater's real-life girlfriend. Well, Sting and, of course, the Ultimate Warrior, Jim Hellwig, had come in as the Blade Runners into Mid-South Wrestling, were super green, and Hellwig did not stay very long and bolted. That's a whole other story why he left. He had gone to Texas World Class Wrestling. Sting stuck around and started to forge his singles career. At this point, he was a member of Hot Stuff International, the faction run by Missy Hyatt and her husband, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. So Sting was a very slowly rising star at this point, was on his own, but still very new to the wrestling business, and it should always be repeated, at least in my opinion, that Sting was not a wrestling fan growing up. He didn't particularly love wrestling or watch it. So when he got in, it's because he was a bodybuilder and because he saw the dollar signs. And so it's not like the Sting that we all came to know and love later. I mean, at this point, his knowledge of wrestling was limited, especially the etiquette and the protocol of what it's like to be in this unusual business. Anyway, Sting one day decided to make the cardinal mistake of hitting on Dark Journey, knowing full well that Dick Slater was her boyfriend. The Dick Slater Dark Journey union, the fact that the people who knew about it was controversial enough because Dark Journey is African American, and an interracial relationship like that between a good old boy like Dick Slater and her in Louisiana, I think you know where I'm going with this. So there was already some controversy, just the fact that they were a couple. Well, Sting is definitely Caucasian as well, but you don't want to mess with Dick Slater, and one way you definitely don't want to mess with somebody is to go after their partner and hit on them, or I don't even know how far it went, but Dick Slater was raving mad at this. So Dick Slater and Sting, like if you put them in a room and said fight, I mean, Sting was just mincemeat. I mean, Sting was not a legitimate fighter in that sense. He wasn't known to be tough or anything. I mean, yes, he had big muscles and he was strong, but Dick Slater was one of the toughest people. It would be like messing with Haku almost, you just don't do it. But Sting, or maybe Dark Journey hit on him too, like a gorgeous young California bodybuilder guy. Who knows how it happened? Anyway, Slater got wind of it, and he said, no, Sting, you and I here. So what happened in the end is, I don't know if they he called him into the washroom, or if Slater just kind of jumped him in the bathroom of the building that they were in. But he delivered an infamous swirly to Sting and flushed his head down the toilet in the backstage area and told him he'd better stay away from Dark Journey. Sting had his own journey down the commode, unfortunately, with his head at that point. Well, it's become one of the legendary, urban legend, not urban legend. It's true. I mean, many people have backed it up. But this is a story of Sting being young and dumb and, just the mess, going after somebody else's girlfriend is a bad idea. But if that guy happens to be Dirty Dick Slater or the Rebel Dick Slater or whatever, very bad idea. And Sting, unfortunately, paid a rookie lesson with his own face and some very bad water pressure. Let's put it that way. So,
we don't know if there were any. We don't know if there were any deposits in the commode.
No, I don't think we do. Probably not. Maybe it was just he probably just threw him into a stall that hopefully was clean, and but no, we don't know that for sure. And that might have been another type of dark journey Sting had to take, if so, the kind that Robert Fuller and Sid know all about. But yes, this is Sting learning the hard way that watch how cocky you are, especially if it's in the face of someone like Dick Slater. Like, that's how naive he was. Like, that's like one of the last people ever you would want to tick off. Like, Dick Slater was just so bloody tough. Like, I don't even know how they made him a babyface in the WWF for his brief run as the Southern Rebel there, but not much of a baby, and in real life, not much of a baby face. I know he done prison time in his older years. I don't even remember for what, but I don't remember. I think he was some kind of violent act. Like, he was not a guy to be toying with. So anyway, they made him the Hardliners with another guy you may not want to toy with, but for different reasons. Dick Murdoch, Captain Redneck, ironically, as it were. But this time they were dressed up as like union mob enforcers. They were like, that was sort of their gimmick, but wasn't too fleshed out. But they dressed like guys who would like, beat you up if you crossed the picket line or something. Like, that was their that was their persona. But unfortunately, they weren't a real tough match for Bill Kazmaier and Rick Steiner, because the Steiners are being pushed to the moon. Scott was on a brief injury break, and Bill Kazmaier, well, I don't know if he's tough, but he could throw you halfway across the room without too much effort. So. But also inexperienced, unfortunately, as a wrestler. Anyway, the Hardliners, because of their age, we're not going to go too far, despite how interesting it was to see them together. So, indeed, Steiner and Kazmaier won. Also that night, you had the Rap Master PN News. Thank goodness he was there, because the summer of '91 was hard, and you need the Rap Master there to complete a card. And he often jerked the curtain, which wasn't much of a surprise. But you kind of have to feel bad for his opponent, Terry Taylor, who was not living down the Red Rooster gimmick too well, just removed a year from it. And
frequency clear.
Can you hear me? You hear me?
It's certainly not on my end.
Okay, no, it's fine. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So, so PN News, if everybody can hear me all right. 1 second. So PN News, I think the Rap Master reached out from wherever he and said, "Hey, buddy, you got to start with yo, baby, yo, baby, yo." So, and anyway, so poor Terry Taylor had to do the job to open the show. You may remember that Terry Taylor and PN News were involved. I think it was, Terry Taylor and PN News were two of the participants in the worst scaffold match in wrestling history, basically, at the WCW Great American Bash '91, where they, instead of having the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express, they had, poor Steve Austin was corralled into this with Terry Taylor and PN News, and who was the other guy? Was it Johnny B. Bad? No, Bob Eaton. Poor, beautiful Bob Eaton. And horrendous opening to the worst pay-per-view. I was just talking about Bash 91. So apparently PN News and Taylor continued their rivalry at house shows. And, well, it wasn't much of a rivalry. And Terry Taylor could easily wrestle circles around PN News, but PN News was Dusty's boy, and he was 450 pounds. So you can kind of guess why things went the way they went. So this is outside the U.S. title tournament. They even had the world champion Lex Luger do a title defense on this Omni show as well against his future Halloween Havoc opponent, Ron Simmons, the one and only.
Damn!
You got it. I was waiting for that. So Ron Simmons had just turned babyface after the incredible tag team of Doom had split up back at... not Capital Combat, but Super Brawl. Super Brawl 1 was the match between them in the cage. They had broken up at Wrestle War 91. Simmons is becoming a big babyface and the big challenger for Luger's title. Barry Windham wouldn't be it. But again, the fans could only chant, "We want Flair, we want Flair." So poor Lex Luger, poor Ron Simmons, everywhere they went, to wrestle each other, fans just kept chanting, "We want Flair. We want Flair." And Jim Herd or no one else at WCW could unfortunately deliver Flair at this point. But before we get to the U.S. title tournament, we were treated to an absolute 5-star Meltzer classic between El Gigante, Giant Gonzalez, and the One-Man Gang in a stretcher match, I believe. No, it wasn't a stretcher match. It was a loser leaves versus hair match. So so One-Man Gang had to put his hair on the line, but if El Gigante lost, he would leave WCW. We should be so lucky. Unfortunately, he'd probably be going to Titan Sports even earlier. But so you can imagine how exciting this match was. I mean, they had just driven poor Sid out, who went to join the WWF at this time, having to wrestle El Gigante in the aforementioned stretcher match. That's why I had the stretcher match in mind. And Sid was gone, so they brought in George Gray, the One-Man Gang, or Akeem, the African Dream, if you will, to do that. And matches were horrible. If you thought El Gigante versus Sid was bad, Gang worked his butt off. He always tried, and he was okay, but Gigante obviously did not catch on. However, they had to give El Gigante the win, and I believe the One-Man Gang got himself a haircut, and Brutus the Barber Beefcake wasn't even anywhere in sight. So with all those big matches out of the way, we finally get to the reason we're talking about this show, and that is the U.S. title tournament. So I'm not going to go into all the results or left, right, and center, but because they get pretty repetitive. But I'll say that Dustin Rhodes, Johnny B. Bad, Enforcer Arn Anderson, Sting, Steve Austin, Diamond Stud, the Yellow Dog, they were all in it. And Steve Austin, I believe, wrestled a good 4 times that night. Yellow Dog and Johnny B. Bad wrestled each other. They eliminated each other in what I believe was a semifinal match. You also had a match between Steve Austin and Barry Windham, who I had mentioned earlier. They would go on the next year to have some really great TV title matches over the WCW Television Championship. But anyway, in the end, it got down to Sting, the man who got the swirly a few years earlier, in Mid-South Wrestling, UWF, versus Steve Austin. Now, that's kind of a dream match by modern standards, right? Sting versus Steve Austin. So here they went at it to determine who would be the U.S. heavyweight champion. And as great as Steve Austin, of course, would turn out to be, and already pretty much was, he was still too new to go over Sting, the company's top guy, really, other than, I guess, Luger. So, and with Flair out of the picture, they're really counting on Sting now. So, unfortunately, Steve Austin screwed up a heel tactic with Lady Blossom, and Sting took advantage and got the win. And Sting crowned for the first time in his career U.S. heavyweight champion after already being a television champion himself. So Sting would begin his U.S. title reign, which would be ended a few months later by ravishing Rick Rude, managed by Paul Heyman, Paulie Dangerously, as the Dangerous Alliance was getting ready to kick off. But this was Sting's night, and he won the U.S. title tournament. So.
And then another event that we thought about discussing. So this coming Sunday being August 31st, I know August 31st is going to be the day of Clash in Paris, but we're not here to talk about Clash in Paris. Most certainly not. There's another very important event that would go down 38 years ago from this coming Sunday. And this would go down at the good old Montreal Forum. And the card pretty much speaks for itself. I mean, I could easily run down the results, but I will give you the floor to give us your thoughts and interpretation of said show itself. Were you there? Were you present that night, August 31st, 1987 at the Forum, or no?
No, unfortunately I wasn't. My first ever show would be 2 shows after this in October of that year. But I did watch a lot of the TV hype for it. I was very much glued to the television as a lot of hype went into this show, as they often did for the Forum house shows. And this was actually a really special house show because it was not replicated in other cities in terms of the main event. Because as you know, as I'm sure you know, Montreal sometimes had its own homegrown angles that were seen and storylines that were seen on Montreal World Wrestling Federation television that didn't take place in any other city. I've heard Bruce Pritchard, somebody you know of quite well, unfortunately, kind of groan about it, how Montreal gets treated special, and it was the only city in the world that had its own angles, even though the rest of the entire world was following the same storylines. And this is one of the reasons for this, is because Montreal had not only its very special different fans to this day that we know, but they also had a lot of homegrown talent that made it big, and Quebec loved cheering on, for the most part, its heroes, its own homegrown heroes. And in this case, they were running a long angle between the Rougeau brothers and Pat Patterson, who by this time was just completely Vince McMahon's right-hand man and an office guy. But once in a while, he'd step back in the ring, and he was going to do so in this case because they built this show around the idea that Brutus Beefcake, once he turned babyface, had allied up with the Rougeaus and done some 6-man tags. But previously at the Forum, this was the Forum show after the Rougeaus, something Jacques Rougeau talks about extensively, where they won the World Tag Team titles from the Hart Foundation, and Montreal went crazy. Like, it was almost pretty much a parade practically outside the Forum, because the Rougeaus had bested the unbeatable Hart Foundation, or seemingly unbeatable. Of course, it was never acknowledged. Jack Tunney, the figurehead president, took the titles back from the Rougeaus. But it got a lot of media coverage in Quebec. Like, news shows were running like stories that, oh my God, the Rougeaus have won the World Wrestling Federation tag belts. This was only a few weeks after this. There was a lot of homegrown stuff going on with the Rougeaus as real hometown heroes. Pat Patterson was, not cheered. He was a pretty nasty heel, even though he was pretty well retired by this point. And Beefcake got in the middle of it, and they were also starting to tour the legendary actor Mr. T as a guest referee who would tour around the circuit. Now, the man who's coming here in September, Paul Roma, who you've talked about recently many times, and we've talked about on this show before, has gone on record in the past to say that Mr. T was supposed to be the manager of Paul Roma and Jim Powers at one point. And the Young Stallions probably would have gone a lot farther had they obviously had the rub of having one of the hottest celebrities, bar none, during that time period on, from television and, of course, in the Rocky movies. Mr. T, I don't know if today's younger people can process it, but Mr. T was pretty damn huge in the mid-'80s, and I'm not just talking about his biceps and his triceps. Yes, he participated in WrestleMania 1 and 2, which we all know. But I mean, the A-Team and him were like the biggest thing on TV for a number of years. Obviously, his appearance in the Rocky movies was huge. So this idea that Mr. T would take a step down, if you will, to become a regular WWF person, even if he wasn't going to wrestle. It was pretty big news, but it should also be noted that this is the summer of 1987, and the A-Team was finished. That was the last year that the A-Team was airing their show, so when they went on summer break, it was a permanent break because the A-Team was finished, and Mr. T would move on to other projects. But for the first few years, I mean, Mr. T was like, a total household name. Why? It's not a coincidence he would be Hulk Hogan's partner at WrestleMania 1. But anyway, in this case, he never wound up being the Young Stallions manager because he didn't show up or whatever the story was. But he was here in Montreal because he was going to be, they were trying to push him as a guest enforcer who wouldn't be a referee like Dangerous Danny Davis. You remember Dangerous Danny Davis?
I most definitely remember Dangerous Danny Davis, the referee that was barred from refereeing due to some chicanery. So he became a wrestler until he once again got reinstated as a referee.
Yeah, and where some have said that they got the idea to do that angle was, are you aware of the potential origins of that whole thing?
I don't want to assume that I know the answer because I'm just going to say no. And this is going to be yet another Freeform Friday sidebar. So without further ado, chat us up.
Well, yeah. So according to one perspective, from somebody who likes to take credit for things sometimes, I defer to the great Bret the Hitman Hart, who actually Montreal, I believe, will finally get the pleasure of having back later this year. But Bret Hart, basically, he was involved in the Danny Davis angle because him and Jim Neidhart were the tag champions thanks to Danny Davis, and Danny Davis wound up joining Jimmy Hart's stable once he left refereeing and became this totally obnoxious chicken heel and everything. But he claims that it was a replica of a very successful angle that was done in Calgary in Stampede Wrestling, where I think it may have involved J.R. Foley, who was a top manager there. I don't even know if maybe he was a referee first. I seem to remember J.R. Foley having something to do with it, but they basically did the same angle that you saw Danny Davis do. You'd have a referee who was a regular established top referee, but suddenly, very subtly, he would start favoring the heels in matches instead of calling the matches impartially, like Jesse Ventura swore that he was going to do for the SummerSlam 88 before, or Mr. T hopefully would do. But yeah, so there was subtle heel stuff, counting too fast if a heel had a babyface's shoulders pinned on the mat in Calgary, but if the babyface had the heel pin, somehow the same referee would count slower. So it started subtly, then people started picking up on it. Anyway, next thing you know, there's an explosion, and this guy is not just your average referee. He's a full-blown heel who's in the pocket and pocketbook of, I guess, a heel faction or heel manager or whatever. And basically it's what happened with Danny Davis. So Bret Hart claims that it's basically the redoing of that angle. He happened to be involved in it this time and whatever, but hard to prove, I guess, because, it may have been done other places too, like on a maybe less notable level, but so this angle may have indeed. The WWF was not above stealing from other promotions, and let's face it, they knocked Stampede Wrestling around quite a bit in the '80s. So for sure, they were pretty happy probably to take some great ideas that had been carried out there. So anyway, Mr. T was going to be the antithesis of this, and him and Danny Davis got in each other's face a lot when Davis, he really didn't, Mr. T didn't like that Danny Davis was as corrupt as could be. And, he'd already, I guess, become a heel manager, a heel referee by that point, a heel wrestler, sorry, had been banned from refereeing. And so there was rivalry. But anyway, there was also a rivalry here between Pat Patterson and Brutus the Barber Beefcake due to Beefcake's affiliation with the Rougeaus. So in Montreal, they weren't doing this in any other city. They were going to settle it, and Mr. T was the enforcer to keep the outside interference at a zero level, keep the Rougeaus out of it. Pat Patterson, I guess, had allied himself with maybe at this point was the new Dream Team, possibly. I think Greg Valentine and Dino Bravo, hometown boy. So the whole show, like the main event, was not like rotating around Hulk Hogan. It was not even going about like the Intercontinental hot title. I mean, there was a bit of that. But the show was kind of built around the idea that Mr. T would appear live in Montreal as Beefcake would battle Pat Patterson, who was called La Reine du Québec uh, during this period. I don't know if he gave himself that name or how it happened. He probably Luigi hadn't cooked enough meatballs by this point. So.
Well, wasn't he still was Pat Patterson still doing that talk show or that segment that he used to do on the the francophone version of WWF programming at the time?
Yes, he was. A matter of fact, that's where this angle stewed, because the only TV time they really had to build it up, other than in like house show promo event center stuff, was that talk show. That's where he'd have Dino Bravo as a guest, and Dino would diss the Rougeos, and he'd have Beefcake as a guest, Pat Patterson, and Beefcake would diss him. So no, you're more than right. That's actually where the angle built up steam, was on Pat Patterson's French language version of Piper's Pit or whatever it was, doing that later would be taken over by Frenchie Martin and etc. So it was built there, and Beefcake and Patterson headlined basically the show, but you still had the Randy Savage Honky Tonk Man Intercontinental. So this is before the big Saturday night's main event showdown between them, and Randy Savage was just turning babyface at this point, and I mean, it was super hot as an idea, but I mean, it would achieve later. Later, it would be the main event, like basically in different places. But yeah, so the show was basically double anchored by Savage Honky Tonk at a very early stage, and Beefcake Pat Patterson. I mentioned Frenchie Martin, Frenchie Martin. He was on the show too, and doing a squash match against journeyman wrestler and henchman
Jerry Allen.
The one and only Jerry Allen, who I'll always remember getting into he was sort of in a memorable squash match against Ravishing Rick Rude that I always remember from those days. He also had a memorable tag match with Demolition. Jerry Allen, again, was somebody who's kind of seemed like he was scraping against the possibility of doing better, but of course that was not the case. Very interesting opener for the show. Chavo Guerrero was on the show, and not the Chavo Guerrero that Attitude Era fans loved in the WWF, but rather the Chavo Guerrero.
So we're talking
Senior,
about
Chavo Guerrero Senior.
Chavo Classic.
Oh, yes, that's right. They call Chavo. I always think of a car when I hear that.
No, Chavo Classic. For those of you that remember, he had a very short stint in the WWE with Chavo Guerrero Jr. And this was, I believe, when Chavo Jr. was the Cruiserweight champion, if I'm not mistaken, or even at one time Chavo Classic was the Cruiserweight champion. Chat, correct me if I'm wrong. And then I remember Chavo Sr. ended up leaving the WWE because he was given some creative, and I don't blame him for refusing to do it, because it's in poor taste, and it's just one of those things where it's like, I just want to do something to you and just get a good kick out of seeing you pull it off. We all know whose idea that is. I won't even go into details, but it amazes me that Chavo Guerrero Sr. had a brief cup of coffee here in the World Wrestling Federation, and he would go on to defeat Barry Horowitz.
Well, I think it's because he was a big part a few days earlier of another topic we're going to talk about after, the Paul Bosch retirement show. And because he was on that show, he was doing a loop with them. And a lot of the wrestlers who were on that show 3 days before the Montreal Forum show would do it. So, yeah, I mean, he wasn't obviously a very regularly featured person there, but But because I think he was already on the tour, and so they needed bodies to wrestle, and he had significantly, obviously, his name in Texas was pretty big. So I think they just let him continue the tour and do some other dates, and that's how it happened. But he was never really a television presence. He didn't do anything of note, but I think he was just on this tour because of the big Texas show that we're going to talk about a little bit after. So yeah, so with those two matches with Frenchie Martin and Chavo, sort of getting people's appetite warmed up. Uh, Things would get really exciting because Paul Mr. Wonderful Orndorff, fresh off his second babyface run, fresh off a second babyface turn against his manager, Bobby the Brain Heenan, would bring the guy who Jesse Ventura used to call that little troll, Sir Oliver Humperdinck, leading Mr. Wonderful for his second chance to be a babyface, which he doesn't, it's hard. Orndorff has a natural tendency to do heel stuff, but it was still pretty popular because he was going to work against Heenan's group, and Heenan can make anything entertaining. So in this case, though, he was just starting out as a babyface again, so they gave him Nikolai Volkov, who would also serve as fodder for Humperdinck's other new charge, Bam Bam Bigelow, on television when all of the heel managers, as you may remember, failed in their bid to get Bam Bam, much like they did with Randy Savage a few years earlier, who wound up, of course, with the lovely Miss Elizabeth. So Paul Orndorff in Montreal for the first time in a long time as a babyface defeated poor Nikolai Volkov, always getting the short end of the stick especially when he wasn't in tag teams, basically at this point. Also at this show, which happened in Texas also a few days before, Fabulous Moolah got another shot to regain her WWF Women's title that she lost in July to the newcomer Sensational Sherry, who, of course, would go on to great WWF fame, but had come from Vern Gagne's AWA at this time, and was given a pretty hot run because Moolah had been champion pretty much forever at that point. So it was a major upset when Sherry got the belt. Sherry, of course, would later be well known for many other things in the wrestling business, but at this point, Sherry was defending her reasonably newly won world title against Moolah in rematches. Demolition would make one of their first house show appearances in Montreal and defeat a team that you just got to love, considering how, well, just like Demolition are real survivors of the wrestling business, so are the Killer Bees, B. Brian Blair and Jumpin' Jim Brunzell, and this time Killer Bees were fighting the good fight in the WWF, but at this show they were no match for the well, they were a match, but unfortunately they couldn't defeat the rising star that was Demolition at this time, who were firmly entrenched as heels with Mr. Fuji as their manager. And then you had another newcomer, speaking of new talent, Ted DiBiase, right at the beginning of his $1 Million Man gimmick, getting incredible heat, and he would have a pretty easy win over Coco Beware at this show. And then just before you had the Beefcake Pat Patterson match, you had the big Randy Savage Honky Tonk Man first time ever type of deal in Montreal, and this would set the stage for what later would become one of the absolute best feuds, bar none, of the late 80s between the hottest heel in the business, the Honky Tonk Man of all people, and Randy Savage. And Savage was just pivoting away from being a heel at this point, but he wasn't ready to win the title again. He had just lost it to Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3, who, of course, went on to infamously lose it to the Honky Tonk Man, in a story that's been told so many times. Even on this show, we've talked about it. So he had to settle for a disqualification loss, basically. So the Honky Tonk Man got his hand raised, and his 14-month Intercontinental title reign would continue at least one more night in this case. And the penultimate match before the Beefcake Patterson confrontation match would be a pretty hot match on paper, King Kong Bundy against Jake the Snake Roberts. And I used to remember being very excited at the prospect of these two wrestling each other. I saw them wrestle each other on NBC on Saturday night's Main Event, and I mean that's a pretty hot match. I mean, even if they're not the most technical workers, I mean, two larger-than-life characters in different ways. King Kong Bundy against Jake the Snake Roberts. And, Jake hadn't been a babyface that long either, coming off his feud with the Honky Tonk Man. And so pretty much a loaded card in a way. I can't say that I was ever excited by the prospect of Brutus Beefcake wrestling Pat Patterson, but I think it had something to do also with the spectacle of Mr. T being involved. And Pat Patterson was a retired guy who could, still meant a lot to Quebec people. But obviously he had a very big behind-the-scenes role there. So, yeah, this is the WWF Montreal Forum. We're talking August 31st, 1987.
Then you wanted to talk about, or we wanted to take a look back. We're going to fast forward a little. So we're going to be we're going to be discussing the infamous ECW infused NWA World Title Tournament, which would go down 31 years ago on the 27th of August at the ECW Arena. So this was, just to preface, just to build it up. At this time, this was when ECW was still considered Eastern Championship Wrestling. However, this was leading to the parting of the ways in which Todd Gordon would decide to fold Eastern Championship Wrestling and turn Eastern Championship Wrestling into Extreme Championship Wrestling. And when the time comes, I can tell the story about how the controversy of this title tournament and the controversy surrounding the winner of said tournament all came to be and how it all happened. So I'll leave it to you, and then when the time comes, I will discuss this. I probably have discussed it on past Freeform Friday episodes, but for those of you that are new and have not seen every single one of our past episodes, I have no problem telling the story again because it's quite compelling stuff.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, so I definitely look forward, as do our viewers, to hear the backstory that you're going to offer and all that. To some people, this would be, if the NWA name still meant something, I suppose this would be a landmark night, because the NWA world title that had been held by Terry Funk, Harley Race, obviously Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, etc., going back to Lou Thez, Pat O'Connor, Gene Kiniski. So they were going to go with this fantasy that was going, basically not just them, but the NWA had, what was left of it had been floating around, so they were going to do a joint show between the we'll say the great New Jersey promoter Dennis Coralluzzo. He definitely elicits some controversy. Maybe you'll be talking a bit about that. I don't know. And the idea that Coralluzzo and Todd Gordon, who you mentioned, were going to work together at this show, and I'll let you talk more about that. In terms of the rest of the show itself, well, you had some great talent there, and some of them had come from the world of WCW, like Too Cold Scorpio and Shane Douglas himself. And you also had on the show, which was kind of interesting, Matt Bourne, who had taken one last shot to at the not national spotlight, but the spotlight, we'll say, and had refashioned himself, a guy who was angry that he had done the Doink character, Doink the Clown, which by this time, of course, had been taken over by somebody who will be in Montreal very soon, Ray Apollo, who continued, one of the guys who eventually continued the Doink legacy. But he was also angry that not only had he been Doink, he was angry that he was Big Josh in WCW. Kind of liked better that he was Maniac Mad Bourne for a lot of the 80s and Mid-South Wrestling and world-class championship wrestling. And, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, where he's from, his father was an absolute legend, Tough Tony Bourne. He had wrestled, of course, Matt himself, too. He actually was on the first WrestleMania. Like, that's a very interesting footnote that is there's a very select group of people that could say they wrestled in the first WrestleMania. I mean, we always, of course, think of Hogan and Orndorff and Mr. T, who we're talking about. But no, Matt Bourne had a match with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 1, which is, I suppose, is kind of a forgotten match out of a few of the undercard there. But anyway, Matt Bourne, by this point in his life, had become legitimately pretty bitter. He didn't losing that WWF job really hurt him in the pocketbook big time. He didn't really like necessarily portraying a clown, but he was making a lot of money doing it. And he had a lot of personal demons, no secret. It's very well documented. So he would lose a lot of high-profile jobs. I mean, he totally amazing wrestler. You can't take anything away from him in the ring. He really was. It's not a coincidence he was on the first WrestleMania, because one thing you could never take away from Matt Bourne is he was a real ring general. And he was a pretty good promo too. That's why Vince McMahon had the confidence in him to make him Doink the Clown, because that's a kind of a lot of responsibility. You know, everybody knew the gimmick was going to get a lot of, you know, scrutiny and heat, and maybe the wrong kind of heat, because after spending all that time denying the WWF was a 3-ring circus, well, all of a sudden you're bringing in a clown. So you know, how can you defend yourself against being a circus when you have an actual freaking clown as one of the guys on your roster? But Matt Bourne was a very special talent. I'm not going to deny my admiration for him. But Paul Heyman came up with the idea at this point, or Paul Heyman was, I think, one of the main masterminds. I think Raven may have had something to do with it too. Although, was Raven there at this point? Raven, I think he'd already left the WWF. Yeah, he was starting to do ECW. He wasn't at this show as a wrestler, but he was around, I think. And anyway, either way, so they wanted to create a very realistic, gritty gimmick where Bourne is rejecting all the past gimmicks that served to stifle his career. So they turned him into like a sort of psychopathic guy who would actually paint like half his face as Doink, or paint his face rather halfway as Doink, to show that he has like a split personality. He has to be Doink to an extent to gain the public's attention, but the real him needs to burst through, and so he became this vicious guy called Born Again, and it was really great. I mean, the promos were absolutely excellent, and in the ring, Matt Bourne could always get it done. The problem is that I think his personal issues intervened again, because he didn't stay very long. He had the proverbial cup of coffee and was gone faster than he ever should have been, because it was starting to pick up steam. So at this show, though, they had him lose to 911, a guy who was not a good wrestler by any means. He was not even really a wrestler, but he would just destroy everybody because he'd was so big, and would give everybody the choke slam that nobody could get up from. So they had this strange gimmick that people in Philadelphia just totally loved of 911, and Matt Bourne was one of the guys at this show that did a job for him. Maybe everybody knew he was going to leave again, so because, you know, to kill the Born Again gimmick, if they thought he was going to stick around, would have been a great shame to have him just do a quick job to 911, who doesn't even really have any wrestling ability. It's, you know, the choke slam later got really hot with the Undertaker and this and that, so that was that, and Born Again lost on this show. The other big news out of the show, besides the NWA title tournament, is they had an ECW tag team title change where the Public Enemy, of course, the inimitable Flyboy Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge. Flyboy Rocco Rock, just as a side note, I've mentioned it before on the show, had an amazing independent run as the Cheetah Kid. Before, you know, under a mask in like a leopard suit or a cheetah suit, before he ever became the streetwise Flyboy Rocco Rock. And he was a big favorite on the independent scene before that in the Northeast. You can actually check, I don't know how many are available, but he had a pretty amazing series of matches going with Dr. Tom Pritchard, when Pritchard was wrestling purely independents, and in Alabama, in Continental, and in Texas. The Cheetah Kid Tom Pritchard matches were very highly anticipated. Anyway, but back to the story of this ECW NWA show. Public Enemy were the champs, but they were going to lose it on this night to Mick Foley and Mikey Whipwreck, the very unlikely team of the another bitter WCW guy who was very happy to be in ECW, Cactus Jack. Foley doing the Cactus Jack character, and Mikey Whipwreck, everybody's favorite beloved underdog. So Cactus and Mikey were just too much for Public Enemy. And then there was the tournament, which involved Too Cold Scorpio. It involved Chris Benoit was in it, but he lost to Scorpio right away. You had Too Cold Scorpio wrestle 911, who I guess was coming off his victory over Born Again. So they did actually let 911 lose at this show finally. And Shane Douglas worked his way. Dean Malenko was also involved. Anyway, in the end, it came down to Shane Douglas and Too Cold Scorpio, which is always going to be a great match. And Shane got the win. But the real story wasn't so much the matches. The real story is what in the world happened and how did it happen with the NWA World Title and the conversion of Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And for that, I turn it over to my capable partner, David Buchanan, who's going to share the story with us.
I'm sure most of you have heard the story before if you've seen some, if not all, of Shane Douglas, Troy Martin's shoot interviews. So how this all came to be and all the controversy, which I will get to, surrounding what the outcome would be, was it all started when Shane Douglas had appeared on Mike Tenay's radio show. So Mike Tenay was a WCW commentator as well as a TNA wrestling commentator, and he was always used for his insight when it came to Lucha Libre wrestling, when WCW began introducing that style over on Monday Nitro. So back to the story. Mike Tenay had a radio show in the early 90s, and Shane Douglas made an appearance on said radio show. And one of the questions that Mike Tenay had asked him were, what are your thoughts on, one, Dennis Coralluzzo and what he's been saying about you? Now this, according to Shane, was news to him because he had no dealings nor any interaction with Dennis Coralluzzo. He knew the man was in charge or part of the NWA, but had never had any business dealings with him. Dennis Coralluzzo had made an appearance on Mike Tenay's show separately and had said that Shane Douglas is not to be trusted and that he is he's dishonest and he's undependable and he will no-show wrestling events. And at this time, Shane Douglas was, I wouldn't say struggling, but he was trying to take any type of possible booking he could get. So if you're creating a rumor or if you're making up a story, especially when you depend and you rely on independent bookings, it gets to a point where this is very slanderous stuff. So that's how Shane took it. And that's how I would take it. I don't know the full story. I only know the story that Shane Douglas told. Dennis Coralluzzo has never, as far as I know, gone on record to tell his side of the story. All I know is Shane Douglas's side of the story that he has discussed in shoot interviews, as well as the Forever Hardcore documentary, which is a terrific companion piece that coincides with the rise and fall of ECW, as well as the ECW One Night Stand 2005, which was supposed to be a one-off, as well as the Hardcore Homecoming, which was the, anti-WWE ECW One Night Stand. So it got to a point where in the locker room, Dennis Coralluzzo went up to Shane Douglas and acted like he acted like he'd never said the things that he said, and he shook his hand and he says, "Hey man, so nice to meet you. We're so happy that you're going to be our champion." However, Shane decided, I'm going to say something. I'm going to say something. And roughly, and it was off script. It was a shoot. It was improvised. And shortly around this time, Shane Douglas's father had passed away. And one of the greatest pieces of advice that Shane Douglas's father had given him was, it's very easy to be mediocre and that it's very easy to be middle of the road. But a lot of the revolutionaries, a lot of the famous people are the most controversial. And the reason that they got to be as famous as they are, or as well known, or was because they thought outside the box, or they went against the grain and they had controversial thoughts and said controversial things. Now, Shane's explanation is a little more eloquent than the explanation that I gave. Now, getting to the point after the match was done, Shane was, no pun intended, wrestling with himself when it came time to give a acceptance speech, so to speak, after winning the then NWA World title. And it was, should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I? And I won't give you a full transcript of the promo or the speech that was cut. And it just, and part of it was where he pointed to the sky and says, "This is it tonight, Dad." And then he would pay homage to the former NWA champions that came before him. And then it all ended with, "And they can all kiss my ass." And then he threw the title down and took the ECW title. Now, the side note, as a sidebar, as this is going down in the ring, Dennis Coralluzzo is looking over at Todd Gordon, as per Todd Gordon's interview, and he's got like his fingers in his mouth. But he's saying to Todd, he says, "He's pissing on the belt, man. He's pissing on the belt. What are you doing?" And then Todd said, he says, no, don't you worry about it. It's okay. It's an angle we're shooting. So then they cut, though. Then there were some promos that were cut backstage with Dennis Coralluzzo, and where he says, "Oh, what Shane did was very embarrassing," and so on and so forth. But little did he realize that he had just got punked. And after this shoot or this stunt was pulled, it was when Todd Gordon decided to fold Eastern Championship Wrestling and create Extreme Championship Wrestling.
Yeah, well, that's exactly true. But there were a lot of accusations, though, that Coralluzzo did a lot to sabotage ECW shows. So Coralluzzo, by some, is not looked at as an innocent bystander in this. He was really paranoid, really jealous about, really concerned, especially when ECW was looking like they were going to get much bigger press than any promotion that Coralluzzo had run, that they were going to get television, that so there were stories. Now, whether Coralluzzo, if it's true, or if Coralluzzo is directly or solely responsible, that Coralluzzo did a lot to hurt ECW, and stuff like calling up the fire marshal and telling them to get over to the ECW arena because they're beyond the safety capacity, and then they start counting heads and the fire marshal would show up. And so they would do different things to screw with ECW that apparently Coralluzzo may have been. Now, Coralluzzo is no longer with us. Of course, we don't want to speak ill of him, and he's not here to defend himself or what have you. And as you said, he may not have extensively defended himself in a public forum, but I don't think too many ECW people were that sad to see the separation there, because when Eastern Championship Wrestling first started, Gordon and Coralluzzo made a gentleman's agreement not to promote on each other's turf, that Coralluzzo would stay in New Jersey and Gordon would stay in Philadelphia, but sometimes they'd get together and have a joint show with all the talent together, such as this one. But, Coraluzzo has his defenders and his allies, but there are also a lot of people who didn't feel he was a pretty secure individual, then to the point where he would go and purposely sabotage anybody he felt was a viable or even a superior competitor. So there may be even underlying layers to the story in general, in addition to all the great details that you provided, that they wouldn't want to work with a Coraluzzo type. And Coraluzzo devoted himself to getting petty revenge anyway against ECW and just to try to stop them from getting big, because his promotion wasn't going to get super big. So take it for what it's worth.
Right. I know there's a lot of other things that went down at this event, but I think we pretty much covered all of the highlights, so to speak.
Sure.
Shall we move on to the next?
Yeah.
I know we have a couple other topics to talk about. Shall we move on, or were there any other notes that you wanted to add regarding this ECW event?
No, they were all said, and you told the story quite extensively, and provided the Freeform Friday viewer with great information about what the backstory was behind it.
And we're going back to almost a week from Monday, August 25th, 1997. This would be the date where founding member of the Four Horsemen, Arn Anderson, would formally announce his retirement from the ring. And that would be turned into, and I don't want to turn this into another sidebar, but this was, it was one of the most, I will say, watching it back or remembering it from watching it on Monday Nitro, was probably one of the most heartfelt retirement speeches that I had ever heard. And the following week, it would be parodied by the NWO. And of course, that came under a lot of controversy. And there are those that say it was one of those angles that was extremely in poor taste. Care to add your thoughts about this infamous retirement of one of the greatest of all time, the Enforcer Arn Anderson?
Yeah, I mean, it was sad. It was sad because even though Arn Anderson looks older than he is, he had only a 15-year career in the ring at that point, and a lot of his contemporaries had like double that. And the accumulation of neck and back injuries had just become too much, to the point where he couldn't move his left hand properly anymore, or he didn't have any feeling in it. And one day he realized, when he was at a gym and he tried to pick up a 20-pound barbell, he just couldn't do it. And so he went to the doctor and like, what should I do? Can we fix this? And they said, no, you're not going to have use of this in a capacity where you have to put strain on it. So what are you going to do? Have Arn Anderson wrestle as a guy with two functional legs and one arm? No. So basically, he tearfully, and the tears were legit. I think you can see Ric Flair crying on this very moving retirement speech, and it was a premature. He had the best years of Jim Crockett Promotions. He had a run in the WWF. He had a run under Jim Herd and K. Allen Fry and Bill Watts and Eric Bischoff in WCW, but it still seemed like a pretty abrupt end to his career. And of course, Arn would continue in the wrestling business, but I guess in other capacities. But yeah, you're right. The real story that came out of this, aside from the sad fact of Arn retiring way sooner than he would have wanted to. Look how long it took Ric Flair to retire. I'm not even convinced that he is retired. And I'm always afraid that Ric Flair, when he's not soiling himself in public, might decide to step back into the ring. I think he wants to. It's just a matter of legalities and logistics. And So, but yeah, I mean, it's not only is that poignant speech remembered, that NWO parody has become one of the most legendary work, shoot, heat type of segments in wrestling. Certainly one of the first, because before this period of, when Bischoff revolutionized Monday Night Wrestling television, um, it was very rare that you'd see like somebody doing like a giant shoot promo thing or an elaborate skit where you start bringing like shoot elements of the wrestlers' real lives into it, and we're basically revealing what wrestlers how they would live their life behind the curtain. So a lot of new ground was broken here, but yes, a lot of feelings were really hurt. Arn Anderson was devastated at that NWO parody. I mean, Bischoff had to take a lot of heat, and Bischoff and Ric Flair, I don't think were the best of friends by any means at this point. So yeah, I mean, the bigger story besides Arn's unfortunate retirement came with this new way of promoting angles and feuds, where basically you start bringing in shoot elements, and you take, the way that Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels would take shots at each other on the mic below the belt and talk about shoot stuff that was going on in their real lives. But here, the fact that these nasty NWO guys would take the trouble to dress up as the Four Horsemen, do some pretty wicked impressions of them, and make fun of Arn Anderson for having alcohol dependency issues. I mean, this was something that, I know later on it became. I mean, even before this, they had done it with Jake Roberts and Jerry Lawler in the WWF. Of course, they would really tastelessly do it with Mike Hegstrand, Road Warrior Hawk, whose real life addiction struggles were horrible, and but this was kind of breaking a bit of new ground, the way that Eric Bischoff or Tony Schiavone would give away the raw results right on Nitro when the show would start, and doing things that just were taboo before. But this wasn't only taboo as a wrestling presentation. The NWO guys and Bischoff really hurt, well, at least Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. I don't know about the others, but definitely Flair and Anderson. And the Four Horsemen were like kind of being reduced to like a joke of these guys who seem to ride the top of the wave of the top of the industry with limousines and jet flying and caviar and champagne. But here, those NWO guys were shedding light to an audience that a lot of wrestling fans were not smart at this point yet. The internet was still young. Not everybody read Dave Meltzer and Wade Keller. Certainly not Between the Ropes, I'm guessing. I know for sure. But so, like, what do you mean Arn Anderson's an alcoholic? What are we talking about here? And Ric Flair, like, why is he being mocked when he's the dirtiest player in the game? So in fact, the NWO parody became a much bigger story than Arn Anderson's actual retirement, and to this day, it's kind of, well, that's remembered a lot more, unfortunately, than Arn Anderson's retirement speech was the NWO parody a week later. So it's really fascinating stuff, and you get to see about this idea that wrestlers are actually real people with real emotions that can be hurt. The Arn Anderson went on record, I think, to say that his family, his kids, didn't need to hear this at home, their father being humiliated on television. And we all know that Kevin Nash and Scott Hall are not above troublemaking and, causing locker room drama, whatever. But here they are doing it outright right here on television. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the NWA parody eventually overshadowed poor Arn's premature retirement.
And now we're going to move on to an AWA house show, which would go down in Green Bay, Wisconsin, back on the 27th of August in 1986. This is not really an era or an organization or should I say an event or an organization that I'm kind of familiar with, but not very familiar with this era, because this would be considered, I wouldn't say the it was, I wouldn't say it was the beginning of the end, but it was getting to a point where
Yeah.
you knew the end was
Well,
near.
just the fact that they had to keep relying on old stars that just were aging out. And I mean, Vern Gagne liked that. I mean, he loved having old cronies there. Hopefully they could still go. And, Vern Gagne, very much a traditionalist. But no, you're right, of course. I mean, they lost everything from announcers and wrestlers and managers to the WWF and even some to the NWA. And the AWA was clearly on at least the beginning of the real downward slide, but they still had the presence on ESPN daily and or whatever it was. So they had national television and they weren't going down without a fight. Let's put it that way. So Vern Gagne was a scrappy dude, and I guess his son Greg had some of that too.
Well,
And
you can also say that, not to disrespect the late great Vern Gagne, but he was just that stubborn and that hard headed that he would just not throw in. He would refuse to throw in the towel, no matter how bad things got.
That's absolutely true. And as a hilarious side note, the era we're talking about in the AWA was right when Eric Bischoff and Sonny Ono came out with Ninja Star Wars, and Bischoff would bring it to Vern Gagne not long after this, and basically begin his illustrious immersion into the pro wrestling industry, for which I still wish I had a dartboard with Eric Bischoff's face as the bullseye for. As I did during a lot of the mid 90s, especially pre NWO and the WCW days. But yeah, so very well said. I mean, the AWA was hardly on fire here, but there were some great talents. I mean, Kurt Hennig was by far the most interesting young talent that was still around at this point, and you kind of felt like he should be in the WWF or the NWA, which of course he would go on to do, but at this point he was still a top dog. And like Greg Gagne, his dad had a long-established tradition in the AWA, and Kurt Hennig had also done stuff in Don Owen Pacific Northwest Wrestling, but very much an AWA fixture. So do you want me to just briefly talk about a little bit of what went on at the show?
Oh, absolutely. But here's one of the things that I wouldn't say surprises me. It doesn't surprise me at all, because it just goes to show you that what a workhorse Kurt Hennig was. As per the notes and results that you sent me, he would wrestle a singles contest against a Mr. Go, and then he would also work in a tag match alongside Scott Hall, and they would go up against Ali Khan and Nord the Barbarian.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, Kurt Hennig and Scott Hall were, a hot young team there. And Kurt, basically with the shortage of talent they had and the cost of flying wrestlers around or making them drive around and the travel costs. So not unusual to see somebody work twice. But yeah, Kurt Hennig definitely had the impressive chops to do so. And yeah, it's worth mentioning also that the Kurt Hennig Scott Hall team, some people thought they could also do big things together, but Kurt Hennig was just so good. He was destined to be more than a tag team wrestler. Well, we all know how Scott Hall's career trajectory took him into various places and characters, but this is still like Magnum PI Scott Hall and the blonde hair kind of, and the or no, maybe his hair wasn't even blonde yet at this point, but he was basically considered a Tom Selleck lookalike who was very physically imposing and pretty good in the ring, but still kind of green. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, Kurt Hennig did a double shot at this point, and in groups like the AWA, I'd say it wasn't uncommon because just cost too much. They didn't have the budget to. I mean, you had this sometimes happen in many other promotions too. So, but yeah, Kurt Hennig is a good guy to do it because this is like young prime Kurt Hennig, only 5-6 years removed from his debut, his early WWF run, which some people forget about in the early 80s. And Kurt Hennig was pretty much at the top of his game and 1 year away from being given his only run with the AWA world title, but he ran with it for a good year. So year plus. So Kurt Hennig was, good point. Kurt Hennig was on the way up. I'm always fascinated by the fact that Jimmy Superfly Snuka was wrestling for the AWA at this time because, of course, he had been ousted from the World Wrestling Federation not terribly long before. And though he did have a very, very famous run in the Mid-Atlantic Jim Crockett area back in the late 70s and early 80s, his stock was falling, and the AWA was, not the hottest place to go, but it was a paycheck, and they did have national television exposure. So there you had Jimmy Snuka getting work and going against a guy who would soon leave for the WWF, Boris Zukov, after the Iron Sheik got himself fired along with Jim Duggan. And of course, Boris Zukov would go on to a legendary tag team career as half of the Bolsheviks with Nikolai Volkov. But here he was losing to Snuka, which he would also lose to Snuka in singles competition more than once 2 years later when they were both in the WWF together. But so a reasonably notable show. Greg Gagne and Larry Zbyszko going to a no time limit draw, no contest. Greg Gagne and Larry Zbyszko were actually related in real life, as you may know, because Zbyszko was married.
Because Larry Zbyszko was Vern Gagne's son-in-law.
Right, exactly. And Gagne and Zbyszko were portrayed as polar opposites. Zbyszko is the sneakiest heel in the room versus Greg Gagne, the squeaky clean, rugged amateur wrestler style guy who was once part of great tag teams. And Greg Gagne was a guy you could count on. Obviously, he wasn't going to leave the AWA of his own volition, and so he often found himself like one of the top baby faces. The future Berserker, Nord the Barbarian, that you mentioned, also on this show as well, and a very fascinating main event because Nick Bockwinkel went against a guy I have a lot of respect for, the late Colonel De Beers, Ed Wiskowski, one of the most underrated and yet controversial characters in wrestling, because aside from what he can do in the ring, he had some very, very controversial and very captivating characters that he portrayed in his career. He never got to really do it in the WWF, and he never really got to do it in WCW, so a lot of people have kind of forgotten about it. But when he was in Portland as the Great Maharishi the Great Maharishi, and he had some he had some regular characters too, but Colonel De Beers, the ultimate politically incorrect character, a pro-apartheid character who was not shy about telling you how Caucasians are superior to everybody else. And, he even had the infamous, do you remember the loser gets painted black match, which was an infamous AW?
I can't say that I've ever seen nor heard it, but it wouldn't surprise me that this is something that wasn't. I should say it wasn't taboo.
No, it wasn't.
You couldn't do it by today's standards, but then again, back in the 80s, it was a whole different era, and I guess it was just a way to get heat on one Colonel De Beers. But
it was.
I don't recall it, but now that we've started discussing it, this will be yet another Freeform Friday sidebar. And this week's sidebar is brought to you in part by insert sponsor here.
Not the color one.
We don't really have any sponsors at this time. However, if you would like to become a sponsor and you would like us to sponsor your product, we would be more than happy to help you out, and we would be more than happy to assist. Excuse me.
Yeah, totally. So actually, in a way, I think I had it backwards because it wasn't so much a loser gets painted black as that his African-American opponent would get painted white if he lost the match. And this was the basic angle where Colonel De Beers was set up in a feud with Starfire Derek Dukes, a very capable young AWA babyface who was African-American, and of course was very offended by De Beers' white supremacist pro-apartheid South African colonel gimmick, which of course on TV that's who he was. It wasn't a gimmick, right? So Derek Dukes was kind of standing up for American values and equality and this and that. And De Beers was so subtle and brilliant that when they were having matches, like at one point I remember, I think they had an African American referee, and De Beers said, "Nope, that's not good. I will not have my match refereed by a black man. Get him out of here." Like he would actually do that, and he would be very reticent to lock up with Duke because he didn't want to touch a black person. Like it was that horrible. It was that horrendously, backward. But I mean, the heat was incredible. Like you said, it got De Beers all this heat, and to go so far as to like, well, I'll paint you white if you lose, So I mean, this is the kind of, they had a national television contract with ESPN. That means ESPN had to allow this stuff, and they had sponsors. So it's amazing what you could get away with. I mean, even then, it was pretty controversial. I mean, even the announcers like Lee Marshall, who would go on to WCW, you remember Lee Marshall announcing in WCW much later on, I'm assuming?
Most definitely. I most definitely remember Lee Marshall, and I would see some of Lee Marshall's earlier work in the AWA as well, thanks to the wonderful DVD collection that the WWE would release in the winter of 2006 called The Spectacular Legacy of the AWA.
Amazing, yes. So even the AWA announcers were openly appalled at De Beers' racism and xenophobia, and so even then they played up the controversy, but it was allowed. Whereas today, I definitely don't think so, and it would be, it would be completely sacrilegious and completely taboo to do something like that. But amazingly, they got away with it then. Like you said, it was the 80s, and consequences be damned. So so De Beers was on this house show getting a shot at Nick Bockwinkel, and the Colonel De Beers character to me is one of the most insane yet underrated characters because he was so good at it. He was such, even when he was the great Maharishi, he was a really great, he could have been a great actor, like in the legitimate world of Hollywood, so he was a good wrestler, but he was just an amazing guy when it came to personas, and he doesn't get the kudos he kind of deserves because, he wasn't in the WWF really doing that. He wasn't in WCW, but the fact that he passed away recently makes me kind of yearn for the talents of Ed Wiskowski, a.k.a. Colonel De Beers. And that's all you really had to this house show that was notable, but it was just kind of notable because the AWA at this time still believed they could hang on with the Vince McMahons, with the Jim Crockett's, and eventually with the Ted Turners of the world. So.
Now, our last topic for the evening, before I get into some of the announcements that I was teasing or building up to, we're going to be talking about, and we discussed this earlier, the final topic of tonight was the Paul Boesch retirement show, which would go down in Houston, Texas on August 28th, 1987, and it would be a sellout crowd of 12,000 fans that would turn up. Some of the guests that would be honorably mentioned would be Bruce Pritchard, Mike McGurk, Pete Doherty on commentary, and there would be appearances from the likes of Vern Gagne, Stu Hart, Gene Kiniski, Ernie Ladd, Jose Lothario, Billy Red Lyons, Boris Malenko, Vince McMahon, Pat Patterson, Lou Thez, and Jack Tunney, with Boesch making a retirement speech during the later part of the show. And it would feature Ted DiBiase having a kid sing Yellow Rose of Texas, saying he would pay him $300, but later refused to pay after saying he wasn't satisfied. And you would also have Bruce Pritchard conducting an interview with luscious Johnny V, in which he was shown almost bald following a hair versus hair match from earlier on in the evening, which we will get to. and with Johnny saying that Greg Valentine would get even with Beefcake. Now, let's get into the whole card itself.
Yeah,
What do you chat us up?
sure. Well, and it's as for DiBiase, well, I could hardly blame him. That kid really sucked. He was not. The card is actually available to watch on YouTube if people want to see it. I mean, they edited it because it's a WWE airing from the old days of their first on-demand stuff. So they cut out certain things, but I'm glad they left that in though, because that kid was. It's not like the other skits you see on WWF television where people would try their hardest. This kid was like intentionally flippant or whatever. But no, the show is notable. I mean, Paul Bosch, just like Vern Gagne, had to be kind of dragged kicking and screaming into retirement. I mean, the main reason he was probably retiring is because Vince McMahon had destroyed the territories, and it's not so much that he's like, oh, well, I've had a good time. It's time to enjoy, some recreation. And it wasn't really like that. I mean, it's Houston wrestling had fallen apart because Vince McMahon had swept in, and Texas, well, he couldn't get Dallas at that point because the Von Erichs were still strong, but Vince McMahon pretty much got the rest of Texas. It's just like in Tennessee. Vince McMahon could promote the WWF well in every city except Memphis for a long time, which did survive. But so Paul Bosch had to join him rather than beat him. And Paul Bosch is one of those rare respected promoters. Like when we were talking with Rene Dupree, you had said that his father was one of those rare promoters who everybody respected and liked, and you could trust him, and he was honest, and he paid well. And there's a very, very select, small number of promoters that everyone could pretty much agree on. And like Emile Dupree and like Don Owen, like Paul Bosch was one of those people. He had a better payday than just about anybody. He wasn't a controversial bully like a Bill Watts or a whatever, and he was liked, and the Houston territory was so hot for a long time. And problem is unfortunately that Fritz von Erich took a lot of that away from Paul Bosch and took the main Texas booking sort of arrangement to Dallas, and things eventually fell on hard times. Gino Hernandez, of course, went to World Class and he died, and so the territory had been through its fair share of lumps, and the WWF just swept in and took it over, which is the real story. I mean, the card itself was just a regular WWF card with a few exceptions, and all these special guests. But the story was that, and Bruce Pritchard, of course, had come from Paul Bosch first to Mid-South and then to the WWF. And so not an easy time for someone like a Paul Bosch, and they were, like many territories, going the way of the dinosaur. But in some ways, the card that they had was not even so incredibly different than the card we talked about earlier at the Forum, because this was just like the tour coming through, and they made a big deal out of this show. But it was essentially a house show with some extra trimmings. Like WWF did that in Montreal too, and Mad Dog Vachon had his, accident. And in March 14th, 88, they had a WWF Forum house show, but Mad Dog Vachon was there as a special guest, and they did a plaque ceremony, and they had some other guests, but it was still a regular house show. So just like at the Forum, you had Sherry and Moolah basically doing their routine. In this case, though, you did have a world title match because Hulk Hogan came out to wrestle the one-man gang. Pretty hot house show feud, never really feuded on television. But Hogan and gang, saw one of their matches live. Of course, that was the record-breaking Montreal Forum indoor attendance record at that time, which would be a few months after this. You did have some interesting people on the card that normally wouldn't have been, like the aforementioned Chavo Classic, Chavo Guerrero Sr., who in this case would actually wrestle Terry Funk, who was not a WWF guy at this point, but because it was Terry Funk, this match took place on the show, Chavo losing to Terry Funk. Terry Funk would not continue the tour, but of course Chavo would, even to Montreal. Another interesting match that was unique to the show was the aforementioned Dr. Tom Pritchard, who I was talking about in reference to Ted Petty, Flyboy Rocco Rock, and the Cheetah Kid. Tom Pritchard would be on the show, the brother of Bruce, who got his start in Texas wrestling, and he would go against the old-timer maniac Mark Lewin in the twilight of his career. Mark Lewin in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had been this amazingly built babyface, very talented, successful wrestler, but it took Kevin Sullivan to make him cross over to the dark side, and one of the most infamous, I'm not going to say angles, but I guess you could say vignettes that's ever been done, where Mark Lewin emerges out of the sea and is demonic, and they took him from a white bread babyface big built guy to this satanic guy that was possessed, and he continued in that gimmick. So but he lost pretty quickly to Pritchard. I mean, Mark Lewin was basically at the end of his career at this point. Bruno Sammartino got back in the ring, something he didn't like to do very often. Of course, he would do it because of his son David, but I'm guessing in this case it was more because he liked Paul Bosch. And unfortunately, Hercules Hernandez was was his victim on this night, but by countout, Bruno got the win by countout. And if you watch the match, Bruno's really energetic in this for a guy who's supposed to be old. I mean, he's more feisty than a lot of the younger wrestlers on this card. So very, very, very well done. And yes, you did have the Johnny V match with Brutus the Barber Beefcake, a match that had gone around the loop many times. And we even saw a television match where Beefcake shaved the head of Johnny V, his former manager, early in his babyface run. Do you remember Beefcake shaving Johnny Valiant's head, Johnny V's head on
Vaguely, but probably, I think probably it was one of those things where apparently he was really not well liked in the back in the locker room. So I think that this is one of those things where almost kind of like when Sean Waltman, X-Pac, cut off Michael Hayes' ponytail during the infamous plane ride from hell. I think that's it's one of those things where, people, there are so many people that can't stand someone so much, but they just can't or won't do something to that person to show their intense dislike. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was one of those moments where everybody in the back or in the locker room just popped, because apparently he didn't have a lot of friends in the locker room and a lot of people really didn't like him. And Johnny also didn't really care for a lot of people in the business either.
Well, I'm not totally aware of it, but I could believe it. I mean, I think the reason I kind of took it for what it was at the time was also because they wanted to build Beefcake as a babyface slowly, and one of the first people they could give him easily and sacrifice to Beefcake was Johnny V, because he wasn't a full-time wrestler anymore. He was a manager. So like Bobby Heenan, if he stepped in the ring, it was no big deal for him to lose. He's not a full-time wrestler, so I thought it was just an easy way to launch, because they didn't want to give him Greg Valentine till later. Dino Bravo either. They waited a little bit, not as long as Valentine. So I thought Johnny V was like an easy first person to give him, especially to launch the barber gimmick, because you could cut his hair even on house shows a bit. And they did it here. They shaved his head and at the Paul Bosch retirement show. But yeah, no, you may very well absolutely be right that he wasn't very well liked, and that this was a way to kind of get him or something. That could very well be true as well. So good, interesting sidebar. Thank you for bringing that sidebar into it. Now, another interesting note on this show is the fact that Jim Duggan, who had lost his job a few months earlier because of the infamous incident on the New Jersey Turnpike with the Iron Sheik, but enough people had lobbied for him that, with Vince McMahon right there in attendance at this show, Duggan was going to get a chance to get his job back if he had a good match with Ted DiBiase, the same DiBiase who wouldn't give that kid the $300 for Yellow Rose of Texas. Now, DiBiase is an amazing wrestler. DiBiase and Duggan were well acquainted with one another from Mid-South Wrestling, so it wasn't that hard for them to have a really good match, and Duggan got his job back because of this show. It's an interesting little factoid. Duggan got offered his job back, which of course he readily took right away. And, he does owe Ted DiBiase, I guess, a debt of gratitude, partially at least, because things would have been different. And, as Andre used to call him, cross-eyed Dugan would not have gotten his job back if he had never got his job back. You'd never have the Jim Duggan that people still celebrate for his, multi-year run, and he would have never come back after the Turnpike incident. Another interesting match on this show, Tony Atlas, who was basically pretty much finished. No, he was finished with the WWF, but he was doing his Black Superman gimmick, which I'm not sure if that has racial over. I guess it kind of has some racial overtones, but he would actually dress in the Superman cape, but like with a big yellow S like written on the cape or whatever. And in Texas, he wrestled as the Black Superman, and he would come onto the show and team up with the Junkyard Dog, still an active WWF member, and they would have a tag team match where they would go against Kamala and Sika, who were infamously wrestling as a tag team at this time. I would say Kamala and Sika's most famous match together was against the aforementioned Young Stallions, the ones who were never managed by Mr. T. They had a pretty famous Superstars of Wrestling match, and Kamala, though, it was kind of a demotion because, he was wrestling main events with Hulk Hogan, and now he's like in a comedy tag team with Sika. It was a pretty big demotion, and Kamala would soon be gone from the WWF after this. But on this night, they had the Junkyard Dog and Tony Atlas, seconded by the Big Cat, Ernie Ladd, who would be in Atlas and JYD's corner. Ernie Ladd and Texas Wrestling are also quite synonymous, just as he was with Bill Watts as the booker for Bill Watts in Mid-South, Ernie Ladd as well. And in the main event of the show, basically, they brought in Mil Mascaras, the Mexican legend, who was obviously huge in Texas as well, to team up with Tito Santana, Arriba. You do the Arribas pretty well.
You mean, Arriba! You got to say it with much more enthusiasm.
I leave it to you. There you go. Well done. So Mascaras and Santana would team up, a Mexican legend versus a guy with Mexican sort of roots, even though he's American. Tito Santana would team up to basically go after Demolition. And Demolition, who a few days later would readily defeat the Killer Bees in Montreal. Here they'd lose the match by disqualification because it was the last match of the show, and Mil Mascaras, he doesn't do jobs, right? So
No, yeah. No, yeah.
Exactly. And Tito Santana was on the verge of forming Strikeforce at this point with Rick Martel, had been wrestling as a single for a long time, but on this occasion teaming up with the Man of 1,000 Masks, the Man of 1,000 Holds? No, the Man of 1,000 Masks, I believe. Mil Mascaras, no job, going for the win to send the fans home happy at the Paul Bosch retirement show with a DQ win over Demolition. And that was that show. If people want to watch it, the edited for WWF Pallets version is available on YouTube. I should mention so. You'll also see some of. Yeah.
I'm sure that the full version of it is available somewhere.
Oh, it could, yeah, probably is, but again, I mean, other than the ceremony stuff, I don't know, or whatever most of it, I mean, it's still a very intact show, and even as a treat, you get the hometown Texan opening the show, Sam Houston, who was forging a brief WWF career for himself, and going against Steve Lombardi, and that's on the show as well as the Curtain Jerker. So pretty entertaining for a house show. The DiBiase angle is great, as always. DiBiase was very early on doing the $1 Million Man skits, and that's great television. And can't go wrong. Just to see Tony Atlas in that cape dressed as Superman, that's worth the price of free admission right there. So,
and with that, we put a bow on this week's episode of Freeform Friday. So before we sign off and before we sign out and let everybody go, I said I had a couple of announcements to make. So tomorrow night, August the 30th, will be BEW, Best Entertainment Wrestling X CWA. So this will be going down tomorrow at 3001 Rue De Louvain Est at the Centre La Salien. And tickets are still available. General admission is $20. VIP is $30. And you can still get your tickets at 438-898-9292, or you can also purchase them at the door as well. I'll take you briefly through the card, and the reason that I'm going to be talking about it is yours truly will be there one form or another. We shall see what will happen. But I am going to take you through the card if you are interested in what you can anticipate tomorrow night. So the card is as follows. You will have Jeremy Prophet defending the BEW Championship against Kevin Gray. You will also have Jason Petitclerc going up against John's Taco. You will have Jessica Black, the BEW Women's Quebec Championship. This will be the BEW Women's Quebec Championship match. So Jessica Black, the defending champion, will go up against Mick and Rose. You will also have Chocolate City going up against Genesis and Darko, Casey Austin taking on Brad Alexis, and Alicia P. Monroe taking on Maria Belmont, and the Green Phantom will be taking on Marty Lang. And I will be there at the show in one form or another. And if you see me, recognize me, say hi. Don't be shy. I don't bite that hard. And that takes me to my next announcement. So, for those of you that don't know, Saturday, September 20th will be the very first wrestling convention ever put on in the city of Montreal. And this is brought to you by Captain's Corner and LWA Live Wrestling Auctions. Tomorrow night, JF Firestorm Leduc, as well as Joe Mikazi, will be having a table set up at the venue, at the arena, promoting Slamfest, which will be going down Saturday, September the 20th. Tickets are still available. If you want the early bird, that'll be $40. General admission will be $20. And what you can expect when it comes to Slamfest is as follows. You can also purchase your tickets if you haven't already at slamfest.ca. I should also add that on Friday, September the 19th, if you are interested, and this is a limited event, VIP event with 3 members of the BSK crew. So you'll have Charles Wright, who you may know as the Godfather, Papa Shango, as well as Mark Canterbury and Dennis Knight, Henry and Phineas Godwin, or Tex Slashinger and Shanghai Pierce from their WCW days. This event will be $100, and it is a VIP event. and it will include an exclusive signed picture, group picture. And however, food and drinks, alcoholic or non-alcoholic drinks, as well as food, is at your own expense and is not included. Slamfest will commence at 10 a.m. Saturday, September 20th, and I will run you down the card as to what to expect. So Charles Wright will be doing double duty, appearing as both Papa Shango and the Godfather. There will also be Marco Estrada, Mario Mancini, Barry Windham, Paul Roma, Carl Leduc, Ray Apollo, and Claude Giroux, Doink and Dink. And also Claude will be performing double duty as Dink and as Tiger Jackson as well. You will also have female indie legend Lufisto, who will also be making an appearance. Oh, and also Dennis Knight will also be performing double duty as Phineas Godwin and Midian. And we will also have Pat Laprade, Bertrand Hébert, Michel Letourneur, Bronin Billington, Richard Charlin, our good friend Marc Blondin. Soyez-y, mesdames et messieurs. I mentioned him, and I saw him actually. He was over at Castle Buchanan, or Buckingham Palace, as Firestorm likes to call my place. He's been over on numerous occasions. So, of course, shout out to Monsieur Marc Blondin, who also has a wrestling show coming up the night after Slamfest on September 21st. And you'll also have Bruce Hart, if I haven't mentioned it already, who will also be attending. So I will let you know all about Marc Blondin's event. Just give me a moment so that I can plug his events as well, because he's a good man and he's a good fan. Wouldn't say he watches us as we go live, but he tunes in from time to time, and he's very happy that we support him, because he's a really, really good man, and you know, we're very happy. We're very happy to know each other. Let's put it that way. So what's going to happen is on September the 21st, there will be an event taking place in Mirabel at the Centre Culturel Val Espoir, located at 17,700 Rue du Val d'Espoir, 17,700 Rue de Val d'Espoir à Mirabel. General admission will be $25. And also there is a $40 general admission, which includes a meet and greet with Doink and Dink. And if you would like to purchase a table, that is available for a cool $500. So you will have Doink and Dink, Doink will be making an appearance, and also one of the other people that will, and also Jeremy Prophet will also be taking on Eddie Edwards. So it will be a combat en simple. And this will be a special attraction match. So Jeremy Prophet, who will be wrestling tomorrow night at CWA, and will also be making many other appearances on Sunday. And next week as well, will also be wrestling at Slam Mania against TNA roster member Eddie Edwards. And I also have another announcement that I want to bring up as well, because I don't want to forget these fine folks over here. So now there's been a little bit of a change of plans. So there was going to be a fundraiser that was supposed to be set up in the East End of Montreal on October the 4th, brought to you by NAGP Wrestling, which was conceived by Ronald Lawrence Cooney, as well as Stella Underwood and Josh Cooney, or should I say Josh Angel, who will also be appearing tomorrow at CWA's show as well. Now, the event or the fundraiser has moved to, giving you the address now. So there will also be two shows. So there will be a 2 o'clock show, and this is going to be taking part at the FML Dojo, which will be situated at 435 Avenue Laurier in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. So, Deck Hockey Saint-Jean, 435 Avenue Laurier à Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. October the 4th at 2 p.m. So, this will be a fundraising event for children with intellectual difficulties, and the funds will be going to the Summit School. But it's also to raise awareness and raise money for children that suffer from intellectual difficulties. So this event will have Jason Petitclerc taking on John Rivière. Zach Patterson will also be there, opponent to be determined later. Chocolate City taking on Yann Ladoux and Bryce Alexander, one half of Summer Buds. Yane Harrison versus Owen O'Neill. Underrated taking on Kyle Nicholson and Will Wharton. Kyle Zachary taking on a mystery opponent. And Flying Frank Milano will take on the angelic Josh Angel for the NAGP North American Championship belt. Tickets will be going on sale this coming Monday. And for further information, please reach out to those that are responsible for the NAGP Wrestling Facebook page, such as North Star or Ronald Lawrence Cooney, for further information and to purchase tickets. And then there will also be a second part, which will be going down at 7 p.m. if you are interested in attending. So, this will be Beast King FTM and Hatch Corsair taking on Jacko the Preacher, Noble Charles Sheehy, and Sunny Soleil. Green Phantom and Sexy Eddie will be taking on Bray Della Russo and Tyler Knox, with Sugar Shane Pinto. Jessica Black and Wendy Chevary will take on Leah Sparks and a mystery partner. And Stephen Maines will take on SDC. Yane Harrison will take on Bradford Montague. Alexander Cable will take on Salazar. And for the North American Championship match, KL Shock and CJ Felony will take on Josh Angel as the defending champion. And he will also have Cowboy Roy Diamond in his corner. However, cards are subject to change, and tickets for both shows in the afternoon and in the evening will be going on sale this coming Labor Day Monday. If you do have any questions, you can always reach out to me, or you can also follow the NAGP Facebook page to get all the information that you need. And last but certainly not least, next Friday, September the 5th, 8 o'clock Montreal time, will be a first time for Freeform Friday as well as for myself. So on the WFM Wrestling Figures Montreal Facebook page, I will be doing my first ever live wrestling auction. It's going to be a little different from Josh Gontovnik's auction, and it's going to be a little different from some of the other auctions you probably are used to watching from folks over at LWA or WCA Wrestling Collectible Auctions over in Gatineau. It's going to be a little different. And why do I say it's different? Well, if I told you, you would know. And then it ruins the element of surprise. There will be items going up auction style. There will be a claim sale. There will also be the opportunity for you to ask me anything you want. Well, almost anything you want. And if you want me to talk about my present point of view about topics that are in the wrestling news or the rumor and innuendo mill, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions and have some kind of a conversation. And let's have some fun. So let's have an auction and let's interact. And that's all for this week's episode of Freeform Friday. I really want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in. And hopefully, if you were unable to live, please catch the replay. See you guys later. Take care of yourselves and each other. Love one another. And also, most importantly, take care of yourself. Take care of your health, your physical health, as well as your mental health. Because you only get one shot at life. And it's important to take very good care of yourself, like I've been doing most recently. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. He's Allan Greenberg. I'm David Buchanan. Take care. Have yourselves a good night. Have yourselves a good weekend, and we'll see each other next time. Take care. Bye-bye.